This giant suitcase just full of money. I mean, big bills, maybe even checks you could write. And imagine if you were driving around or walking around and you ran into people who had some kind of a need. And you could just give them whatever it was that they needed. Imagine I can't pay my rent. Here you go. I can't pay off my school loans. Here you go. I can't pay the utilities. Here you go. Imagine if you just had all this money and power to be able to make that kind of difference in people's lives. Would you do it? Imagine if you actually, even on top of the money, had the skills to make a difference in people's lives. I have cancer. Here you go. I have problems in my relationships. Here you go. Imagine if you had it within your hands to make all the difference in anybody's life. Would you do it? You see, it's really interesting in this series that we're going to take on here over the next 2 weeks, which are good stories. There are a couple stories in the Bible that talk about what it means to care enough to meet people's needs. Today we're going to talk about the Good Samaritan, and then next week we're going to, talk about good dirt. Believe me, there's such a thing as good dirt, and I hope you'll come back for that. But as if you brought a Bible or a device, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 10, and it's interesting because coming out of Mission Celebration, and by the way, thank you so much for trusting the Lord, bringing a faith promise that is the highest we've ever had. And if you haven't participated in that yet, what faith promise is simply saying, God, what do you want me to give toward the mission ministry of this church around the world in 2020? And that's what those cards are. You just write it down. You don't put your name on it. It's not a pledge. It's faith promise. And what we do then is that's how we determine our budget and decide who we're going to help, because that's what the Good Samaritan is all about. But I want you to know it's about a whole lot more. Some of you were here when we talked about the All series and what it means to love the Lord your God with all. And we came and brought little all boxes and we presented them at these altars to say, God, here it is. Here's everything that I am and everything that I have. And it's actually in that greatest commandment that the Good Samaritan story was taught by Jesus. And so let me just remind you, there was a lawyer who asked Jesus this question. He said, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus looked at him and said, well, what does the law say? And here's how the lawyer replied. Verse 27, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now that's where I want to actually pick it up, is that verse 29 there. He wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? Now, when we're confronted with the high bar of Jesus, and the command to love God with all, listen, men and women, we can begin to justify ourselves. We know we have attitudes that are not all in when it comes to Jesus. And so we begin to make excuses instead of challenging ourselves to lose what God tells us to lose and to add what God tells us to add. We find someone to blame, we make excuses, or as Jesus used it, we justify ourselves, our attitude. So the story Jesus is about to tell, the Good Samaritan, is about the heart of the lawyer as much as it is the good deed of the Samaritan in the story. Before we read the story, though, let me make this statement to you as we unpack it. The story of the Good Samaritan is all about the attitude of every human being. So in other words, you're in the story. You might be the lawyer. You see, Jesus asked the lawyer to answer his own question. What does the law say the greatest commandment is? He knows it. He taught it to others. He could probably quote it in 3 languages. He knows all about it. It's the second part that gets him, though. You will love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't have to ask about loving God or loving himself. He has those two down pat. But the tough question about loving his neighbor, he knows he struggles with that one because he does not see all people equally. And that's really important for us to understand before Jesus ever teaches him about the Good Samaritan. So his question, well, who is my neighbor? Is a question he thought Jesus would answer in the same way he would answer it. Well, my neighbor are people that I like and people who are just like me, right? Well, no. That's why Jesus makes sure that he unpacks it for him. We can all do that. We can justify our negative or prejudicial attitudes toward individuals or people groups, whether it's the behaviors of their children, or the color of their skin, or the countries they come from, or even the government programs that they might use. We begin to justify our disdain and our lack of respect based on some history, some experience, some story we've heard about people like them. And we forget that Jesus calls us to see them as our neighbor. Jesus calls us to love them. Now, I really look back on my days in college I just loved college. I bawled like a baby the day I graduated. I loved it so much. And one of the things I enjoyed the most about college was playing basketball. And our starting five at our little Bible college was really diverse. We had an American Indian, we had an African American, we had an urban white boy, we had a boy from a small town in southeast Ohio, and then we had this guy who was the son of an evangelist, so he never lived in the same town more than a couple years. And that was our starting five. I learned a lot about life just from the guys who were my teammates. And that American Indian guy, Mike Martinez, I can remember many nights in his dorm room, and he began to tell me stories that he opened up my eyes to racism and rejection and ridicule, and he faced so many stereotypes of who he was as an American Indian, as a Navajo. And I asked him, I said, Mike, please, if you ever hear out of me an attitude of superiority, if you ever hear out of me an attitude of racism, I want you to tell me, even if I say I'm joking. That's what we do to justify it sometimes. Oh, just joking. Just kidding. I said, please tell me. See, Jesus' parable actually starts before the story he tells. It starts with the attitude of the lawyer. Is there any attitude in me that's racist or prejudicial or judgmental or condescending to any person or group? I mean, that's the question that we need to be asking ourselves before we ever get into the Good Samaritan. Is there any person or group that I think I cannot love? In other words, is there anyone that I won't accept as my neighbor? Now, I want you to raise your hands for me. How many of you know the story of the Good Samaritan? I mean, trust me, it's not a trick question. You can answer. Yeah, I know the story of the Good Samaritan. Well, here's the thing that you maybe don't know that you don't know, because I don't know a lot of things that I don't know. You can't understand Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan unless you understand how people viewed Samaritans. Because that makes the story completely different if you fully understand it. They were despised by Jews in Jerusalem. Despised by a lawyer, an expert of the law, like this guy that Jesus was talking to. History shows there was great disdain among Jewish traditionalists and those Samaritans up north. You see, the Samaritans up north only believed in the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't accept the history. They didn't accept the poetry. They didn't accept the prophets. They only accepted the first 5. And it created a lot of division between them and other Jews. And there was serious prejudice, serious animosity between the people of the south and the Samaritans of the north. So much so that if you were reading John chapter 4 and Jesus runs into this Samaritan woman at a well. And she even looks at him when he talks to her and she says, Jews don't talk to Samaritans or women. And it's funny how then John adds a little sidebar where he says, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. They hated each other. And historians highlight that they also had some violent encounters between each other. So this is the relationship that Jesus is dealing in, the context of which he begins now to teach this lawyer an answer to his question, who is my neighbor? Now listen to the story, remembering that the story is to answer that question. Beginning with verse 30 of chapter 10, here we go. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, where he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. And he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now, maybe it never occurred to you, if you knew the story of the Good Samaritan, that Jesus would make the hero of the story a person that the lawyer despised. When Jesus asked him which of these 3 was a neighbor to the man, the lawyer couldn't even say Samaritan. All he could say was what he did, the one who showed mercy on him. You see, that's another big takeaway from the story. The Good Samaritan is all about the value of every human being. How much God values all of us. Now, so many people think the Good Samaritan story is just about making sure we help people in need. And that's a great lesson to learn from it. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But that's not the main purpose of the story. Remember, Jesus was answering the lawyer's question, what is it? Who's my neighbor? Also remember that the question was in response to Jesus saying that the second greatest commandment was what? To love your neighbor as yourself. So the lawyer is asking this question, who do I have to love? I mean, come on, Jesus. I can't love everybody. I mean, there's stupid people in my life. There's people I don't like. There's people who have done mean things to me. So who is my neighbor? Who do I actually have to love? The Samaritan, despised by the lawyer and his people, becomes the person who acted the most neighborly, and there was a point to be made. Every human being is highly valued, men and women. Every human being is your neighbor and a person you are to love. Even the Samaritans in your life, you're to love them. Let me see if I can help you understand it this way. Let me retell the story in 21st century Greenwood, Indiana. So there's this guy riding west on Smith Valley Road, getting ready to come to Southland Community Church. He's riding on his bike, and some of the local tough guys see him, and they like his bike. So they go attack him and beat him up and leave him for dead in the ditch and take off with his bike. And coming now down the road, down Smith Valley Road, comes Pastor Steve. And he sees the guy bleeding in the ditch, but he's late for Bible study. So Pastor Steve swings around to the other side of the road and comes on him, because you got to be on time to Bible study. And then a little while later, here comes Pastor Phil. And he's late for choir practice. And Pastor Phil says, you're not allowed to be late for choir. If you're not early, you're late for choir practice. And he looks over, sees the guy bleeding in the ditch, and he swings around because he's got to be on time. And then an illegal immigrant from Mexico comes driving down Smith Valley Road in his 1990 Chevrolet, and he sees this man bleeding and dying in the ditch. And he pulls over, and he opens up the back seat door, and he lifts this man up, and he puts him in the back seat. And the closest hotel is the Knights Inn up here at 465 and 37. And so he drives there as fast as he can. And he takes the guy in, and while he was talking to him in the car, discovered the guy didn't have any medical insurance. And so he goes and gets a room for him, and he does everything he can to take care of this guy, to mend his wounds, because no one else is going to be able to help him. And he looks at the guy who's running, the general manager of the hotel, and he said, look, here's a couple nights rent for the room, and I'm coming back to check on him, and if you have any other expenses related to this guy, I will cover them. And then he goes. Now, which of the three were the most neighborly? Which of the three acted the most like they believed the second commandment to love your neighbor as yourself? The two religious types? The two spiritual guys with titles? Or the one that a lot of people in this nation would say they despise? You see, men and women, every human matters to God, and therefore every human should matter to us. And I get it. We have very complicated political issues. I get it. There are serious debates in our country as to how to handle complicated social issues. And no matter your views on how to best handle these complicated issues, you must start your solutions with this, that every human being matters to God. Everyone. But just because someone disagrees with you on how to implement policy, it doesn't mean that they're heartless. There could be another way to help someone than your way. But the point is, just because someone disagrees with you, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't carry the high value of every human being that God has for them. And if you devalue any human being in your heart, listen now, because this is what Jesus was telling the lawyer. You don't have the heart of God, and you don't have love for God. That's what he said. Every human being matters to God, and therefore every human being should matter to you. And that reality should lead you to action. Let's go back and read it again, verse 36. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him, and Jesus told him, go and do likewise. You see, what he's teaching us here, the Good Samaritan, is all about the responsibility of every human being. Who is the neighbor? The one who took mercy on him, the lawyer said. The one who took responsibility for another human being in need. And while the spiritual ones found something more important than the needy person in front of them, the despised one is stepped up and took responsibility for him. He didn't just help him up or wipe his wounds and tell him he would pray for him. I'll pray for you, brother. He sacrificed. He saw the need, responded to the need, used his resources for the need, and then he followed up the need. I mean, he did everything he could do because he valued that person who wasn't like him. And no matter the difference in ethnicity or culture or religion or past history, the despised Samaritan accepted the responsibility to care for someone who needed him, someone in need right before him. But remember the other characters? The other religious leaders, Pastor Steve and Pastor Phil? Remember those guys? when he saw him, passed to the other side. In other words, he saw him and ignored him. Saw him and ignored him. They devalued him as a human being when they abdicated their responsibility to take care of him. Jesus is saying loving God means loving your neighbor, and your neighbor is every human being. Loving your neighbor means seeing your neighbor, looking for your neighbor's need, and then taking action, taking responsibility for the neighbor, no matter how that neighbor has behaved in the past. My good friend Salim Karat, he lives in Lebanon. He's a part of a church in Beirut. And he and I were just reminiscing a couple weeks ago when I was in Cyprus over a story that he told me a couple years ago. And what happened was when the Syrian and the Iraqi refugees started flooding into Lebanon, people had to figure out what to do with these millions of people that were just flooding in. And the church that they were all part of had about 350, 400 people in it, said, we've got to help these people. And so literally hundreds of people were coming to them, and they were feeding them. They were clothing them. Some of the people in the church were even opening up their homes to them. And Salim told me the story of where he stood at a table and they were offering soup to Syrian refugees. Now you have to understand something. Syrians and Lebanese hate each other. They don't respect each other. They mock each other. There is serious division between those two cultures. And now here come all these Syrian refugees, and Salim said, as I handed them their soup and their meal for that day, they were mocking me, ridiculing me, calling me names, devaluing me as a person. He said, but I just served them with grace. I sucked up all of my prejudices and my ideas about them, and I put those away, and I decided to be an example of the love and grace of God. Men and women, I want you to know that today, 1,000 families are now part of that church because these Lebanese Christians got over themselves and got over their prejudices, and they reached out and served them no matter how they treated them. And today they're Christ followers because they demonstrated the grace of Jesus, because they recognized they were their neighbors who they were to value. Now, we can overcome our upbringing, our education, and our attitude history by making a choice today. We can ask God to cleanse our attitude and help us value everyone and empower us to take responsibility for our next door neighbor literally, the people in our community who are hurting, the people who we work with that are struggling, and people all around the world who need our care. We can take responsibility for our neighbors if we're willing to sacrifice. And if that's not enough for him to just teach us that through the story of the Good Samaritan, let me just tell you, in Matthew 25, Jesus is talking to his disciples about what it's going to be like at the judgment. After we leave this world and we stand before God, he said, it's going to be like this. I'm going to separate the sheep who are the righteous from the goats who are the unrighteous. And I'm going to say to the sheep, I welcome you into the kingdom of God because I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you cared for me. Now, the interesting thing is the sheep or the righteous are going to look at Jesus and say, Jesus, when did we do all that for you? When did we feed you and clothe you and visit you and care for you? And he says, look, whenever you've done it for these, the least of my brothers, you've done it for me. And then he starts talking about the goats, the unrighteous, who he says to them, depart from me, I never knew you. He says, because I was hungry and you didn't give me anything to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was naked and you didn't clothe me. I was a stranger and you didn't invite me in. I was sick and in prison and you didn't care for me. And they look at him and like, when? When didn't we do all this for you? And what did he say? When you didn't do it to these, the least of my brothers, you didn't do it to me. In other words, your actions are evidence of who it is you're really following. Your actions are evidence as to whether or not you are truly embracing the greatest commandment of God, to love him with all, and the second, to love your neighbor as yourself. Look, I'm so glad God was a good neighbor to you and me. And when he saw us lying in the ditch of our sin, he didn't just pass by on the other side and ignore us. He came running to our rescue, and he met us at our greatest point of need. And what did he do? He sacrificed everything so that we could be forgiven, so that we could have eternal life. And men and women, what is he telling us to do? Go and do likewise. Stop ignoring your neighbors who are in need and become intentional, serious. Go looking for need among your neighbors and be willing to give everything that you have, everything that you are, to point them to Christ because of the way you serve them. You serve them the way he served you. Nothing, he considered nothing as his own, but he gave everything to see you in your deepest hour of need and rescue you. He took responsibility for your salvation and gave himself up at great price. And now Jesus is saying, it's our turn. Now it's our turn to find our neighbors, even the ones we really dislike, to find them and find within ourselves the love of God, to love them as well. So, I'm praying about this passage, and all week long, I'm like, okay, well, great. We're supposed to love our neighbors and serve them. How do I respond to that? I mean, what am I supposed to do now that I've heard this? Well, it probably starts with a confession. It starts with confessing that perhaps you have looked at people as less than valuable to God. Maybe it starts with asking him to wash your attitude toward the people in your life, local and around the world. And then it starts with asking him to help you to value them the way he values them. And then ultimately, you ask him to help you begin to see how you can serve your neighbor, care for your neighbor, feed, clothe, visit your neighbor. That neighbor who is your Samaritan becomes the one he wants you to love the most. And men and women, that's what makes this a really good story, because it becomes your story when you live it out in your life every day. Would you bow your heads with me? Jesus, and so we'll start there with you, Jesus, with a confession that perhaps I've held in my heart some kind of prejudice, bitterness, animosity toward some person or people group. I want you to reveal that to me, Lord, and show me, and I'll confess it to you. And then, Lord, I pray you would forgive me and give me a whole new spirit. Do heart surgery on me right now. And give me a whole new purpose and desire to care for my neighbors the way you cared for me. Show me, Lord, who needs my help. And then remind me not to ignore them, but to extend love to them. Would you pray your own prayer and respond to what you heard this morning? What is it he's speaking into you? Thank you, Jesus, for all you've done for me. And now help me, Jesus, to live my life for you. In your name I pray. Let's stand and let's close out this service worshiping him and make this song the prayer of your heart. Let's stand together.
I came